Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and explore an absolutely incredible what-if scenario, one that completely rewrites the epoch-defining events of 1492. Now, we all know the standard history, right? Christopher Columbus, the ocean blue, his arrival in the Americas. But today, we're mapping out a radically different path. We're looking at a single, isolated change in the timeline that cascades into a completely unrecognizable modern era.
I mean, it sounds a bit like science fiction, doesn't it? But seriously, imagine if, instead of Columbus's 3 tiny ships carrying 90 exhausted sailors, a massive fleet of giant Chinese floating fortresses just sailed right into San Francisco Bay. This isn't just some fun little thought experiment. It's a really fascinating alternate history that challenges literally everything we know about how the modern world was built. It shifts the entire center of global gravity away from the Atlantic and puts it squarely in the Pacific.
All right, Section 1, the real history, the floating cities of the Ming Dynasty.
So, to ground ourselves in reality before we start building out our alternate timeline, we have to ask the obvious question. Is this scenario even physically possible? And the answer is absolutely. You see, the Ming Dynasty was the undisputed superpower of the early 15th century. Just think about the sheer scale of their engineering for a second. Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was barely 62 feet long. A single Ming treasure ship, on the other hand, we're talking an actual floating city stretching up to 400 feet long with 9 massive masts. These weren't just big boats, they were absolute technological marvels. They had onboard farms, like actual soil brought from the mainland to grow fresh vegetables at sea, along with complex water purification systems. They essentially solved the problem of scurvy centuries before European navies even understood what was happening, completely dwarfing anything else sailing the oceans at the time.
Commanding this legendary fleet was the great Admiral Zheng He. He led 7 epic voyages, projecting immense wealth and power across the Indian Ocean. His fleets were made up to 300 of these massive ships and carried nearly 30,000 soldiers, scholars, diplomats, and doctors. They sailed all the way down to East Africa, trading exquisite silk and porcelain for spices, exotic animals, and ivory. But, and this is where history pivots, imagine the tension in the imperial court as isolationist advisors eventually seized power. After decades of unparalleled exploration, in 1433, they just burned the records. They dismantled the ships, forced China to turn inward, and closed themselves off from a world they had literally just begun to map out.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Pacific Point of Divergence, a change in the winds.
So what if those ships were never burned? Well, in our alternate timeline, the highly ambitious young emperor survives past his real-world death in 1424. By 1432, instead of folding inward, a bold new eastward plan is proposed. Chinese navigators set their sights on the vast, completely unexplored ocean to their right. And here is where nature steps in. The powerful Kuroshio Current, a giant oceanic conveyor belt often called the Black Tide, does all the heavy lifting. This natural highway of warm water pushes the colossal fleet directly across the Pacific. It carries Chinese navigators straight to the lush redwood coast of North America in 1435. That is nearly 60 years before Columbus was even born.
Moving on to Section 3, First Contact, a clash of worldviews.
You have to picture the absolute awe of the indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest, groups like the Coast Miwok or the Yurok, watching emissaries in elaborate silk robes step off these colossal ships onto their shores. So how does this first contact play out? Well, unlike the Spanish who arrived decades later, driven heavily by forceful conquest, extracting gold and aggressive religious conversion, the Ming Dynasty operated on a completely different diplomatic wavelength. Heavily influenced by Confucianism, the Chinese prioritized soft power, prestige, and trade over direct, violent colonial empire building.
They utilized something called the tribute system. So instead of brute force, the Chinese peacefully established diplomatic relations. Foreign leaders offer local gifts to acknowledge China's symbolic supremacy, and in return, they receive immense material wealth and highly coveted trading rights. Just imagine how bizarre, but wonderful, it would be to hand over a shiny sea otter pelt and receive world-class, intricately painted Ming porcelain and bolts of masterfully woven silk in return. The Chinese essentially claim the land only symbolically. Maybe they plant an inscribed stone tablet, but they don't build massive military fortresses or enslave the local populations. You know, they viewed themselves as the center of civilization, so they were seeking universal acknowledgement, not necessarily territorial conquest.
But, well, even peaceful intentions can't stop biology. And this staggering 90% figure represents the tragic mortality rate as Eurasian pathogens inevitably leap across the cultural divide. Because China was part of the exact same Eurasian landmass as Europe, their sailors carried the exact same devastating viruses, things like smallpox, measles, and influenza. The biological impact on the indigenous populations is just as catastrophic here as it was in our real timeline.
However, and this is a massive however, there is a crucial delay in conquest that changes literally everything about the future of the Americas. The Chinese don't stay to occupy. They fulfill their exploratory mission and then leave, sailing all the way back across the Pacific to report their findings to the emperor. Because of this massive geographic and bureaucratic gap, native societies are left with the vital time they need to recover, adapt, and build up immunity. So rather than facing a brutal military invasion while actively suffering from a biological apocalypse, they are left in a dramatically stronger, much more unified position to negotiate and survive by the time the Chinese eventually return in large numbers.
Section 4. Trade, Technology, and Empire. The Silver Revolution.
Okay, let's fast forward decades later, into the next phase. The Ming Dynasty is now facing a massive economic crisis back home. Hyperinflation has basically forced their entire massive economy onto a strict silver standard. So they return to the Americas seeking one primary resource: pure silver. Think of the tension, the sheer spectacle, and the mutual respect as high-ranking Chinese officials walk across the grand, floating causeways of Tenochtitlan to meet the Aztec emperor. The Ming set up these coastal trading outliers in places like San Francisco Bay, which they poetically named Gold Mountain, and down in Acapulco. The Aztecs, who are sitting on actual mountains of precious metals, happily trade their abundant silver for revolutionary Chinese technologies.
What follows is a mind-boggling trans-Pacific exchange that fundamentally alters the trajectory of human history. Life-saving crops like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and corn flow back to China. This sparks a massive population boom because these specific crops can grow in harsh, mountainous soil where traditional rice simply cannot survive. In return, the Americas receive iron metallurgy, steel plows, horses, and most importantly, gunpowder. The Aztec and Incan empires completely modernized their militaries. Imagine elite Aztec jaguar warriors replacing their traditional obsidian blades with forged steel and adopting matchlock muskets. They revolutionized their tactics, creating an impenetrable, highly advanced indigenous defense force.
Which brings us to Section 5, the alternate modern world. The Europeans arrive. Now we jump to the 1500s. When European explorers finally managed to cross the Atlantic during their age of exploration, they encounter a geopolitical reality they could never, ever have anticipated. When Spanish galleons arrive off the coast of the Americas expecting vulnerable, technologically outmatched populations, they are absolutely shocked. Instead of a continent ripe for the taking, they find massive coastal fortresses flying yellow Ming Dynasty flags, flanked by immense native armies wielding steel swords, riding cavalry, and firing highly disciplined volleys of muskets. Basically, the world was already spoken for.
The consequences for Europe are severe, and they are immediate. First off, the Pope's famous Treaty of Tordesillas, which arrogantly attempted to divide the entire non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal, is rendered completely meaningless. Second, because they are completely outgunned and outmaneuvered by these wealthy Chinese-backed indigenous forces, the Europeans are forced to completely abandon their dreams of total conquest. Instead of building massive global empires, they are restricted to operating small, heavily regulated Atlantic trading posts. This turns the Americas into a tense, highly profitable battleground of commerce between the East and the West.
Without the plundered wealth of the Americas pouring into European coffers, European empires remain significantly smaller and much less globally dominant. The United States as we know it today? It never exists. Instead, the map of North and South America is radically diverse. The Pacific coast is heavily dominated by bustling, wealthy Chinese-American provinces. The vast interior of the continent is ruled by high-tech, independent native confederacies that successfully protect their sovereignty. And the Atlantic coast merely holds a smattering of smaller, European-descended republics.
The day-to-day cultural shift would be immense. Just imagine growing up in a timeline where, instead of English or Spanish, Mandarin Chinese becomes the absolute global lingua franca of trade, science, and diplomacy. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution doesn't kick off in the textile mills of Great Britain. Instead, it erupts in the booming, resource-rich workshops of Ming Dynasty China, heavily powered by a steady stream of American coal and silver. This leads to a beautiful, complex fusion of Sino-Incan philosophy, indigenous American ingenuity, and Chinese industrial might, ultimately creating a modern world centered entirely on the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic.
It really is incredible to see how a single historical thread, like an emperor simply choosing to look outward instead of inward, could weave a completely unrecognizable modern world.
So I'm going to leave you with this question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. How do you think history would have changed if China reached the Americas first? Would it have been as diplomatic and balanced as we just mapped out, or would the undeniable lure of empire eventually have turned China into a ruthless conqueror as well? It is truly something fascinating to think about. Until next time, keep questioning the past.
Please like and subscribe.